Hey everyone, my name is Charlie and today I have my March wrap-up. I have arrived at work. It's 8 o'clock on a Friday morning. The bin men haven't removed the skip because someone has trashed it and it's all over the car park. So it seemed a good a time as any to talk about the books that I read in March. I probably won't get to all of them today, but I'm gonna try. It wasn't as good a reading month last month as the previous 2 months. As we know, this year for some reason I have been reading on average 20 books a month. That went downhill this month and I only read 12. I did say that was likely to happen because this month I've actually taken time away from reading to write, and those 2 months any bit of spare time I had was dedicated to reading, and I didn't really watch telly, listen to music, watch any YouTube in that time, so it kind of amounted to a lot of books read. But that doesn't mean that we don't have to talk about these books, what I read in March. So the first book that I read in March was Bloodwitch by Susan Dennard. This is the 4th book in her Witchland series. I believe that originally it was going to be the 3rd, and then you have Sight Witch that sits between these books and is a precursor to events that happen within this book. So it's really necessary that you have read Sight Witch to understand what's happening in Bloodwitch. Personally, I hadn't enjoyed Sight Witch as much as the previous books in the series, but Bloodwitch was brilliant. Filled with plot, and the characters were fantastic, and what I've enjoyed about these books is how we have advanced since Truthwitch, when everything was about the relationship, the friendship between Safi and Isolde. They have reached this point where they're going off and they're separate from one another, and it's exploring their friendship when they're not with each other and how they interact with the other characters around them. This book, as it is Bloodwitch, is mainly focused on the character of Aedwan, and in the first book I didn't particularly care for him, but I think a lot of people have been enjoying this character and seeing certain feelings develop between him and another character. I'm trying very hard not to spoil this book. When I've read the previous books, I've said that I've liked this link to Dennard's other series, the Something Strange and Deadly series, which you get in the form of these people who have had their threads cut. I can't remember what we call them in this book. I've always enjoyed the way that Dennard writes. I've liked that she isn't afraid to torture her characters. When this book came out, she released an essay discussing a certain character's toxic masculinity and how she was working to kind of repent that character and make people... Oh wait, this might be my bin men. Give me a moment. Side note, the bin men just arrived, foraged through our skips for a few minutes, took the skips away, and then placed them not as they were, but in front of one another, because they were in a rush. Anyway, I was talking about Bloodwitch. Susan Dennard talks about how she was trying to erase his toxic masculinity, and I believe that she is working hard to do that. She says that this character has become one of her favourites. I enjoy the magic within this world, but I like that there isn't always the answer, and it's more an extension, a sense that someone would use, because why wouldn't they use it? Because it is part of who they are. I like that we're discovering more about this world, but we don't have all of our questions answered. However, I do have so much faith in Dennard as an author to feel as though she is going to pull this off, and I look forward to seeing where these books are going to go in future. Next, we have a book called Hare Soup. This was a poetry collection that I borrowed off my friend Joy Winkler, and as such, I can't remember who the author is, but I will leave a picture somewhere. I found it particularly inspiring. As I've said previously, sometimes there are poems that come along and you read them and you think, I'm never going to be able to craft poetry as good as this, and that's how I felt with these. There is a use of the Irish vernacular at points within this poetry collection that is used to enhance the poems, and I quite liked seeing that. I enjoy seeing vernacular. I enjoy seeing how a poem will sound and thinking about how it will sound, and that's very much what I enjoy about poetry, is the way words are put together to create a certain rhythm and a certain tone about the piece. It was quite startling to read this and just be so in awe of another person's poetry, and I'm reading more because I'm writing more poetry myself and hoping to improve in that line of my craft. And I think that by reading poems that do make me feel this way, it's hopefully a good start to improving my own writing. Next, I read Freshwater by Akwaeke Emezi. Freshwater follows a character who is born as though they are still connected to the spiritual world, and they have spirits within their mind. So it begins with the we voice, and it follows this character's life, not as though it is being told by the character, but it is being told by the spirits that inhabit that character. This is a debut novel, I believe, and once again, it is impressive. It's an incredibly short book, but it manages to pack quite a lot in there to do with gender, sexuality, spirits, magical realism. Did I mention mental health? Because it is all in there. And I feel as though it could very easily have reached a point where it became tiresome, which is why I think that it's good that the book is so succinct. There is this question as to whether the spiritualism within here is a mental health thing, or whether it is to do with, or whether it is indeed a spiritual experience that this character is having. And indeed, the characters in there do go on to question this themselves. I really like the exploration of craft that the writer had here. They were very much experimenting with the way they wrote, with the way the characters were presented, and it's not something we get every day in literature, so it is something that the reader has to take time to get their head around. At parts, I did find this somewhat confusing, but that didn't mar the reading experience for me. All it did was make me think, do you know what, I'm going to reread this, and I'm going to get it, and I'm going to want to spend more time going through this book and going back and seeing how things link with each other. And I do think that it was impressive and emotive, and that you can't help but feel some sort of sympathy and empathy for the character here. It just felt like reading a version of truth that is different to your own. Next, I read Dragonkeeper, the first book in the Rainwilds Chronicles by Robin Hobb, and it has been over a year since I read any Robin Hobb, and it's been nearly 3 years since the Hobb-along in which I first discovered Robin Hobb thanks to Sam of Sam's Nonsense. I'm aware it's gone very dark. Sadly, the sun seems to have gone in. This book follows the characters in the Rainwilds Chronicles, namely a young woman called Thymara and another woman in Bingtown called Alice. And the dragons that have been taken to the Rainwilds to rise and bring dragons back to the world have all been born stunted with some sort of deformity. There are people living in the Rainwilds who should have been exposed at birth because they have certain defects, and the council decides to task them with taking these dragons up the river to find their legendary home. I've heard before, people don't necessarily like this series, I've heard before that it isn't the best, and that is definitely true. However, it doesn't mean that this isn't still a very good fantasy novel. It is dealing with something we don't always see in fantasy, which I think is something that you get from Robin Hobb. She's always going to do something a little bit different. And here, it very much reminded me of not a Regency novel. I get my periods of time mixed up, but one of those books, a bit similar to Jane Austen, and it's a female-led novel for the most part, and one of the characters has been researching dragons, so decides to move from Bingtown to the Rainwilds after a marriage of convenience gone wrong. And so I was very much reminded of something that I'd seen in Jane Austen, despite the fact that I've never read Jane Austen. A problem I had with this book stems from the fact that previously I have heard that this book was originally meant to be a duology, and I feel as though you can tell that. I am reading the second book currently, and I feel like there was a very good part in that, in which the book could have had its climax, and then maybe have turned the book into a trilogy, I don't know, but 4 books, I'll see how I feel at the end of it, whether it's a full-blown narrative that needed 4 books. But currently, I feel as though Dragon Keeper, by the end of it, the story hadn't even got started. I feel as though it was just, we'd had all of the setup to get these characters to a certain place, but we hadn't really had any resolution, any answers to anything. I don't know that there are many questions, but I just felt like it was a bit, is that it? It's over now, but where's it gone? I enjoyed the book, but I needed there to actually be some sort of structure here that was not present. And thus, it is not one of my favourites of Robin Hobb, but I am enjoying Dragonhaven, and I think maybe if I see the narrative as a whole from book 1 to book 4, I may be able to say I enjoy the entirety of the series, but individually the books might not work out. Next, I read The Snowman by Jo Nesbo. I don't know which book in the Harry Hole series this is, but I think that it's the 5th I've read, and I'm beginning to notice a pattern with these books in which at page 250 Harry thinks he's found the killer. He hasn't found the killer. A bit later he realises who the killer is, then there's a bit of a fight, a struggle, and it ends. And obviously, with each book, the action has to increase, the drama has to increase, and the sense of peril has to worsen. Now, with the Redbreast, I guessed the killer as soon as they were introduced. In this book, I guessed the killer as soon as they were introduced. I still don't care. I still think that these are great thrillers to read, and whilst they're not the best books in the world, I do not care, because for some reason they're just like a tonic to me. Incredibly fast paced, quite dark, quite weird, and I know that things are just going to get worse for Harry Hole, this weird older alcoholic detective who you'd never want to meet in real life, but I'm intrigued by his story enough to read the book and to continue reading the series. I've got another 2 to read this month, and I'm quite looking forward to it. Then I read Travelling Songs by Simon Armitage. I feel like this was a bit of a piecemeal collection in which they just put a load of things together that had come from different places, and I enjoyed it. There were a few more actual pieces of lyric in here that I liked, because as I've mentioned with the Hare Soup book, I like looking at the way things will sound when read aloud, and thinking about the way this would be sung, I just thought it was perfect. There are some deep issues in here that I think were discussed in a very poetic fashion. I'm enjoying Simon Armitage's poetry, I must say. I like the way that he structures his poems, I like the way he makes them sound, and I think that he has a very careful turn of phrase that really creates an impact for the reader. Next, I read Broken Ties by Margaret Holbrook. All I'm going to say is that I enjoyed this book, and I plan on doing a full review of it, so you can expect that at a later date. But should you want a short piece of fiction that travels over a breadth of time following a character who has been abandoned by his mother, then you wouldn't go wrong by this book. Next, I read Over by Christmas, also by Margaret Holbrook, and this was written for a anniversary of the First World War, and I read it because I realised I hadn't read it, and I have to say that some of the stories and poems within here, for it is a mixture, are somewhat heartbreaking when you consider the events that they are talking about. And whilst I know a lot of people have written about the war, I don't think that it ever feels lesser to see more work about them. I think it just goes on to further show that the war was quite the terrible event in our world's history. And someone is reversing. It's the next day. Can you tell it's the next day? I wore the same jumper just in case you couldn't anyway. What happened yesterday was I realised I'd recorded for so long that people were starting to arrive in the car park to go to work. I hadn't yet opened the shop or put any of the money in, and I thought, do you know what? Let's just continue today. So here we are. I believe the last book I said I'd read was Over by Christmas by Margaret Holbrook. If you have the chance, do order a copy. Whilst it is a short collection, it definitely packs a punch. The next book that I read was The Leopard by Jo Nesbo. This is another book featuring Hare Hole, and the events at the end of The Snowman were quite climactic. Like, if the writer had wanted to end the series there, he could have done. And there was very much a Reichenbach Falls, Sherlock Holmes moment there that would have been a great series ender, especially with who this crime was related to. But the story doesn't end there. We get the Leopard. Hare Hole is hiding out in Japan or China, can't remember where. Sorry about it. And he's become a bit of a fan of the opium, and someone's sent out to find him because they believe that there is another serial killer loose in Oslo. So, obviously, Hare Hole, not wanting to, has to return to his homeland, where he finds that certain people are being murdered by some quite horrible means. These books never fail to go for the weird, horrific crimes, and sometimes it's humorous, sometimes it's dark, and this time I felt as though the writer was having to amp up everything because of the way the last book ended. There has been a lot of tragedy in Hare's life. There is a more bleak tone to this book than we have previously seen, and it's also exceptionally long. I still think they're great thrillers. There are parts where I end up laughing and I turn to people and I just tell them because I'm completely astounded that this has happened within a narrative. And I still want, I'm still going to go on and read the rest of the books in this series. And I am something of the fan of these books. And a few years ago, I can't remember who it was on one of the YouTube sci-fi awards shows in which someone described some books as cookie cutter books, and that there wasn't a problem with those. And that's how I feel about these. There is a certain format to them. I know that when I'm going into them, it still doesn't ruin the experience of reading the book for me. However, it may for some other people around here. But I guess that's just kind of the thing of reviewing stuff. You'll like something someone else doesn't. You'll dislike something someone else does. Isn't being a human being great, fantastic, memorable? Next, I read Heads of the Coloured People by Nafissa, Thompson, Spires. Oh my lord, this short story collection is marvellous. It's brilliant. It's any synonym of that word you have heard Charlie use in the last nearly 4 years now, because this writer knows what she's doing. The craft here is fan-bloody-tastic. I mean, the first story in here was crafted in such a way that I was wondering just where the story was going. Was I going to enjoy the rest of these stories based on that first story alone? And then I realised that maybe what this writer likes doing is doing a bit of subversion. Sending you one way, meaning another. There are some great stories in here. This is a writer who knows how to blend humour and pathos in such a way that you're a bit uneasy. And I don't mind that. But some memorable moments for me are stories about the Fruitarian and stories about the woman who is seemingly doing everything in her life for likes on the internet, and how social media is now ruling her life. And another one which is told in letters between parents. When I read these stories, I was reminded of the short story collections we used to have to read at university. Only these tales were more modern and were discussing more modern topics. They felt fresh. They didn't feel like this stagnant prose that we have seen before. There was something that just kind of lived off the page and gave me this frenetic energy as I was reading, because I just wanted to absorb this writer's prose. It was just a really good experience. I think that more people ought to go out and read the stories here. We can have a discussion on them. I'm always appreciative of dark humour, and there is dark humour within these stories. Yes, there is some tragedy within these stories. Yes, not all of them are there to have this humorous aspect. I think that people will really enjoy this collection as much as I did. Next, I read Quicksand Beach. I can't remember who the poet was, and I'm really sorry to say that I can't actually remember the poems. I plan to go back and have another look at these poems again before I return the book to Joy, but at least for the most part, sometimes I can remember a poetry collection, and I felt as though I enjoyed this one. That's the strange thing. When I was looking at this and I remembered that I'd read it, I thought, oh yeah, I enjoyed that, but I can't remember a single poem within there, and that might be my fault. I know I have said before about the fact that sometimes I do read poetry the wrong way, and I may have gone through this book too quickly or been doing other things and not happened to notice it. But I forgot it, basically. I forgot this one. Sorry about it. Finally, in the month of March, I read Illywhacker by Peter Carey. I was gifted this book nearly 5 years ago now. This follows the character of Herbert Badgery, who claims to be over 130 years old. And when the story begins, you believe he is in some sort of retirement complex being observed by nurses and the like. And then he decides that he's going to go back and tell his story. And it's a very sort of Dickensian way of telling the story, in that he becomes almost a omniscient narrator as he tells you about the love of his life, and then the love of her life and her father, and there's something about a snake in here as well. And Herbert Badgery is known to be a liar. Throughout his entire life, he tells you that he has lied, and he is this person who can get what he wants by lying to people. So he crashes a plane and tells the people he's looking to build a aeronautical factory, and he's looking for the money. And he ends up staying with this family, and they're going to be building this factory. And then, obviously, you're following this story that features tragedy and going throughout his life, going into his children's lives. And I ended up downloading the audiobook for this story in the end, because, well, as I've mentioned before, print was extremely small in my edition, and listening to it did enhance the story somewhat. And I don't deny that Peter Carey is a great writer. I love the way his sentences sound, but it's this case of the story just feeling a bit blown out of proportions to me. And I am a fan of the weird and the wonderful and the wacky, and towards the end of this book you definitely need to be a fan of that. It ends up going in a completely different direction than you imagine it will, and that's not necessarily a problem. It definitely feeds into this idea of the story being somewhat Dickensian in style, despite the fact it came out in 1985. But I just never felt connected to it. I didn't find the humour there that I think was supposed to be there. I didn't particularly care that this was an unreliable narrator, because I didn't care. I did not feel anything for the characters, frankly. all of them could have ended up dead at the end, and I would not have felt a connection to a single one. It very much felt as though I was reading a story, being relayed this story about people I didn't know, unable to develop any sort of connection as a reader to these characters, which I feel is something we want to do within our fiction. And so, in the end, I have stuck through a 540-page story because the book was gifted to me. Had I purchased the book myself, I would have given up at about the 100-page mark, really, and that would have missed out a ton of story. I know that. It would hurt. I might have gone to Wikipedia at some point. I don't know. I might have tried to find out how the story ended myself, and if I'd wanted to. I just feel as though I never cared about this book, and that I finished it just to say to my friend that I finished the book that she got for me. And them's the books. If you've read any of these books and would like to discuss them, please feel free to do so in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this video, and until next time, that is all.